So, as Mateusz noted, this presentation comes out of a larger project that I'm working on with Marek Oziewicz, and so a lot of the arguments and the readings that I'm drawing from are taken from this project that we're pursuing. So earlier this week, I gave a presentation on American family films, so I thought it would be appropriate to begin with an American family film, and that is Disney's Muppets Most Wanted, which came out in 2014. And in this film, the Muppets go to Europe on tour, and while they're there, Kermit is mistaken for his doppelganger, the evil Constantine. He's arrested and he's thrown into the Gulag. He knows it's the Gulag because on his way there, there's a big sign, a big billboard in the middle of the steppe with big shining lights that say Gulag this way. And then when he gets there, there's a big sign that says Gulag, as you can see here. When he is there and he's imprisoned, he curries the favor of the king of the Gulag, who protects him. However, he also wins the attention of a sadistic guard, played by Tina Fey, who falls in love with him, but because she falls in love with him, she jealously prevents him from being able to escape. Finally, there is a musical review in the Gulag during which he is able to escape. The Muppets has been known for its parodies of American popular culture, of film, of TV, of music, and other aspects of pop culture. And so this is really clearly a send-up of Cold War era films that involve such tropes as escapes from prison and evil prison guards, or sadistic, exotic prison guards, such as the one parodied by Tina Fey. It's clear, for example, that this is playing on films such as The Great Escape, or even The Sound of Music, with the scene of the escape during a music review. Yet, there's something that's very upsetting to me about this film. For example, even though it is playing off of films like The Great Escape or The Sound of Music, which are set during Nazi occupations and in Nazi concentration camps, clearly it does not set its own story in a concentration camp, in a Nazi concentration camp. To do so would sink the film entirely. It would be upsetting to viewers. It would lead to boycotts, and for good reason, because that memory of such a traumatic event would be so disturbing and would not be appropriate for a family film or a children's film. And yet the question becomes, what makes the Gulag so funny itself? After all, the Gulag was essentially, as Solzhenitsyn says, an archipelago of prison camps, of concentration camps, which, as Anne Applebaum argues in her 2004 book, was a system of Soviet slave labor itself in all its forms and varieties: labor camps, punishment camps, criminal and political camps, children's camps, transit camps. Millions of people died in these camps. And yet it becomes the subject of a lighthearted family film. And so this raises the question, how does the film imagine its audience? What knowledge does it imagine its audience has? And I suspect that it imagines that either its predominantly American audience doesn't really know anything about the Gulag at all, or if it does, really doesn't care, that it finds the concept of the Gulag as distant, both spatially and temporally, that the Gulag was a prison camp system that happened over there somewhere, but really doesn't have that much bearing on American collective memory, American affect, or of the American imagination, for example, in the way that Nazi concentration camps clearly do. And this speaks to a larger North American lack of concern with, or lack of knowledge of, the role of Eastern Europe in the events leading up to the Second World War and the Second World War itself, and also the events following it. So, for example, Norman Davies, who wrote No Simple Victory, World War II in Europe, 1939 to 1945, says in his preface that he always begins his lectures in the UK and North America with 5 questions that I've listed here. So can you name the 5 biggest battles of the war in Europe, or the largest concentration camp that was operating in Europe, the largest nationality that lost the largest number of civilians, the vessel that was sunk with a record number of a loss of life in the largest maritime disaster? And what he finds is that his audiences, who are often very well educated and very knowledgeable about events that happened in the West, in Western Europe during the Second World War. So for example, the storming of Normandy, or the Blitz, or concentration camps such as Auschwitz or Dachau, are relatively lack a relative amount of knowledge about the war in Eastern Europe, even though the largest amounts of civilian lives that were lost, and also military lives that were lost in the European theater of the Second World War, were actually in Eastern Europe. They don't know, for example, that the largest maritime disaster was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff off of the shores of Gdańsk. Or that the largest concentration camp that was operated in Europe was actually the Gulag archipelago. Readers or audiences are knowledgeable of the events of the Holocaust in the West, but only know the Holocaust as it occurred in the East, in terms of deportations to the ghetto, to the Warsaw Ghetto, and to the camps. But they don't really know how the Holocaust affected Jews and others who were living in Eastern Europe itself. Very few know about the significance of the greatest battle of the Second World War, which is Stalingrad, and very few know about the Siege of Leningrad that cost more than 1 million lives. And so there seems to be in the North American imagination, even as Davies argues in the British imagination, a tilt toward the West and a lack of knowledge or interest of how the war affected the East. Part of this might have to do with North American historical pedagogy. So, for example, most North American secondary students learn, correctly of course, that the Second World War officially began on the 1st of September 1939 with Hitler's invasion of Poland. And while this is true, most are not taught this invasion was breach of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In fact, most are not taught what this pact was in the first place, that there was a period of time in 1939 when Hitler and Stalin were in fact allies, and that they did agree to partition Poland, and that it was Hitler who first broke this pact by invading Poland, but only a few days later, the Soviet army invaded Poland as well. So that students learn about the German invasion, but not the Soviet invasion and occupation of Poland. Also, when secondary students learn about the events leading up to the war, the focus is mainly on the fall of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazi fascism, which of course is very important, very crucial to know in terms of the events leading to the war. However, they learn relatively little about how the rise of Stalinism in the Soviet Union played a significant role in the beginnings of the war. Perhaps they learn about the Russian Revolution, they learn about the rise of Stalinism and the purges, but these events are taught as ancillary to, or in addition to, the events of the Second World War, and not connected to it. This may be in part because the Soviet Union, or as it's often called in America, just Russia, was a US ally during the war, and it would be difficult to tell a history about an ally that was actually allied with the enemy of the US and the allies themselves. This complicates the narrative of the Second World War. It makes the narrative less black and white, less good guys and bad guys, and much more complex, and causes a lot of anxiety in the teaching of world history. And so a lot of these details of Eastern European history are brushed aside. Also, North American children's literature also plays a part in this sort of westward trend about thinking about the war. So that in the United States, for example, it is necessary by state law to incorporate Holocaust pedagogy. For example, in my state, the state of Florida, students in public schools are exposed to Holocaust education during their primary and secondary school years. And they read a lot of children's literature in order to absorb this history or to be taught this history. But the books that they read are primarily set in Western Europe, so that most students begin by reading Diary of a Young Girl, which gives a general introduction to the circumstances of the war and how it felt to be hiding, for example, from the Nazis, and yet was set, or it was written in the Netherlands. And we never actually see when Anne Frank is deported, because she necessarily cannot write in her diary, and so we don't see how the Holocaust actually affected her when she was arrested and imprisoned and ultimately died. Other books like Number the Stars or When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit or The Boy in the Striped Pajamas are set in Northern or Western Europe. Most of the books that children in North America read are primarily set in Scandinavia, in France, in Germany. Barely any at all are primarily set in Eastern Europe. When Eastern Europe is depicted as the destination of Jews who were arrested and deported first to the ghetto and then later to concentration camps, but not as the original home of Europe's Jews, even though the majority of Europe's Jews actually lived in Eastern Europe. So that very few children's books until very recently have been set in countries such as Poland or Ukraine or Russia or Baltic countries, Lithuania or Latvia. And then likewise, until recently, relatively few children's or YA books have depicted genocide, deportation, and anti-Semitism in Stalinist-occupied Eastern Europe. An early exception might be Esther Hautzig's The Endless Steppe, which was published in 1968, and which is the story of a young girl and her family who are arrested by the Soviets and deported to Siberia because they are known as wealthy landowners, even though they are not so wealthy in the first place, but are branded as kulaks. But this is really the exception. It's not until much later on that children's books really are set in Eastern Europe and also depict both Nazi and Stalinist atrocities in Eastern Europe. To change in the beginning of the 21st century and around 2010, with the publication of books such as Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. And in this book, this very well-acclaimed book, Timothy Snyder defines the Bloodlands spatially and temporally. First of all, spatially as that place that extends from central Poland to western Russia through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, and temporally during the consolidation of National Socialism and Stalinism, the joint German-Soviet occupation of Poland, and then the German-Soviet War. Mass violence of a sort, he says, never seen before was visited upon this region. So he identifies this region of northeastern Europe as exceptional, as exceptionally affected by the violence of the war, whose civilians were exceptionally affected, as well as whose militaries were affected. He writes the Bloodlands where most of the Europe's Jews lived, where Hitler and Stalin's imperial plans overlapped, where the Wehrmacht and the Red Army fought, and where the Soviet NKVD and the German SS concentrated their forces. He also calls attention to the fact that the Bloodlands was a region of constantly shifting national borders, and therefore a place where people constantly shifted allegiances, political allegiances, not out of their own desire often, but for their own survival. Also, he identifies the Bloodlands as a place of internecine warfare, of a great amount of ethnic cleansing along these borders that complicated these allegiances and made the history of Second World War era Eastern Europe much more complex and messy than, for example, as it played out in Western Europe, where borders were more set and ideologies were more clearly defined across borders. With the publication of this book were also publications of books by public intellectuals such as Anne Applebaum and also Norman Davies, who in some ways are literally reorienting European history to address really this exceptional role that Eastern Europe played and the exceptional ways that it was affected by not only the war itself, but those events that led up to the war. In turn, Marek Oziewicz, my co-author, has identified a growing number of books that he calls Bloodlands Fiction. And in an essay in international research in children's literature, which was really kind of the cornerstone for the book project that we're developing, he identifies Bloodlands fiction as a rapidly growing group of historical fiction that depicts a broad range of Soviet oppression, from armed invasions, mass killings, and group deportations to individual executions and quotidian victimization, unleashed against Eastern European peoples, including Russian citizens, between 1930 and the 1950s. The time frame spans the period between the onset of the Great Famine in the Soviet Union and the years of thaw after Stalin's death, by which time the last pockets of anti-communist resistance across the Eastern Bloc had been exterminated and the first deportee survivors had been allowed to return to their homelands. Works of Bloodlands fiction may be set in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarusia, Poland, Romania, Russia, or elsewhere across the former communist Eastern Bloc. I'd like to make a few comments and qualifications. First of all, Professor Oziewicz deliberately delimits his definition of Bloodlands fiction to those literary works of children's and YA fiction that depict Soviet imperialist occupation and aggression from 1930 to 1945, maybe after 1945, not least because they address traumatic historical events that have until recently been underrepresented. And so in part, this essay that's the cornerstone of the project and his contributions to the project really are an act of reclaiming a lost history or a forgotten history or a history that hasn't yet been spoken. So the emphasis really is more on Soviet experience or the Soviet experiences under Soviet occupation. And yet I would like to qualify that it's very difficult to extract or experiences of Soviet oppression from experiences of Nazi oppression because they are so tightly bound. And so I would like to call attention to how the Bloodlands of Europe do exist spatiotemporally between Hitler and Stalin, as Snyder writes. And so in some of the readings that I'll perform later, I'll talk about those close relationships. I'd also suggest the term Bloodlands literature, partly because some of the texts that I'm exploring, especially one that I'm keeping as a major case reading here, are actually works of nonfiction and yet are very literary. So I'd like to kind of expand that category of fiction to nonfiction to literature. Framing questions that I'd like to explore both in this lecture and in the larger project is how these works expand or reorient young people's knowledge of the Second World War and the crucial events leading up to it, and how specific forms, for example, nonfiction, picture books, illustrated novels, offer new insights to specific audiences, including audiences of different age groups, and what historical myths they might dispel or that they might challenge, and why ultimately Bloodlands literature might be significant within our own contemporary moment. So to do this, I'd like to devote a major close reading or case study to M.T. Anderson's Symphony for the City of the Dead, Dmitri Shostakovich and the Siege of Leningrad, which was published in 2016. And really, this is first and foremost a biography of the Russian Soviet composer, Dmitri Shostakovich, and tells the story of his childhood, his adolescence, his coming into age as a major Russian composer, and finally his composition of the Leningrad Symphony during the Siege of Leningrad. But because Shostakovich's life coincided with the events leading up to the Siege of Leningrad, Anderson is also able to give his readers a history for all intents and purposes, of the Bloodlands. So he begins by telling about Shostakovich's young adolescence and idealistic hopes and dreams and coming of age as an artist during those heady years of the Russian Revolution when everything was possible and utopian hopes were running high. Then he shows Shostakovich's coming of age and maturation during the Stalinist purges when he was nearly executed himself. And then his eventual triumph as the composer of the Leningrad Symphony, but during the Siege of Leningrad, during the Great Famine that occurred there. So he's able to give this history of a larger period of time through a story of a composer. The book also serves as a meditation on music, how music enables resistance or survival, how it gives testimony, but also how music is a form of language, one that discloses, that speaks, but also one that that hides or or is challenged to disclose or represent or fully represent an emotion or a statement that a composer might make. One thing that I think is important to recognize about this book, I nearly said novel because it reads like a novel, is to think about the other text that M.T. Anderson is very well known for. His dystopian novel, Feed, and his historical novels, The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing. Symphony reads like an historical novel. It reads very much like a book like Octavian Nothing. So that Anderson scrupulously researched Shostakovich's life, his letters and communications and letters that people wrote about him. And he went through lots of archival research in order to compose this, so that Shostakovich appears as a fully rounded, sympathetic hero of this text that a reader might be able to follow, so that even though a reader isn't familiar with music theory or with Soviet history, they have this strong hero that they can follow. And in a story and a narrative that involves a lot of narrative tension, a little bit of humor, mostly a lot of suspense. At the same time, this also reads like a dystopian novel, much like this novel Feed. Anderson stated in an interview in 2016 that he wrote Symphony as a dystopian novel that happens to be true. And in this way, even as the book is a reflection on music, it's also a reflection on dystopia. It tries to dispel the reader's belief that dystopian societies are merely fantastical societies that exist outside of our realm, the realm of the real, that might exist in the future. And he resituates dystopia in the past and compels his reader to recognize that dystopian societies have existed, in fact, do exist, and that history itself has served as a source for contemporary dystopian images. And therefore, he calls his reader to take dystopia seriously, that it's not just fantasy. He does this in two parts of the book. So in the first part of this book is really an account of Shostakovich's coming of age during Stalinism. And as Anderson gives the story of Shostakovich, he also gives background information about what was happening during his lifetime. So he calls particular attention to the artificially created famine of 1931 to 1933, or the Holodomor, the Stalinist purges of the 1930s and Shostakovich's survival of them. He was arrested. He was about to be detained and tortured when the person who was going to torture him was, in fact, arrested, detained, and tortured themselves. And so, sort of deus ex machina, he was able to survive the purges. And also, Anderson addresses the near destruction of the Soviet army during the purges. All of these are very important. He makes it very clear that all of these events had a great influence on the events of the Second World War, that it was the artificial Ukrainian famine that was one of the inspirations, as it were, for Hitler's starvation of Russian citizens during the siege of Leningrad, that the Stalinist purges so cannibalized the citizenry of the Soviet Union, and especially of the Soviet army, that the Soviet Union was considerably weakened when Hitler first invaded Poland and the war began. And in fact, Stalin didn't even want to recognize that Hitler had breached the pact that he had arrived with him. As Solzhenitsyn observed, and Anderson writes, not to trust anybody was very typical of Joseph Stalin. All the years of his life did he trust one man only, and that was Adolf Hitler. And in this way, Anderson begins to push against the conventional wisdom or the knowledge of his readers, who imagine Hitler and Stalin as mortal enemies from the beginning, and show it how initially they were actually allies. And he also introduces the details of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And in this wonderful line that I think really concretizes the book, he says, in this way, communism moving to the left and fascism, on the other hand, moving to the right, met like fists behind the back and meet each other there where none could see. In the second part of the book, Anderson uses Shostakovich's individual experiences of the Siege of Leningrad to offer a larger account of the siege. And he shows how this siege really created dystopian conditions in which the city of Leningrad itself became an open-air concentration camp. So he reminds readers of their own knowledge of actual concentration camps run by Nazis in other parts of Europe, and how a city itself was transformed, and how people were literally imprisoned in their own homes, where they were forced to burn their furniture, eat their wallpaper, eat their pets, and ultimately even eat other human beings. And the way that this created not only terrible hunger and starvation and death, but also psychological trauma and severe emotional damage that contributed to these really dystopian conditions. And he gives in very excruciating detail the suffering felt by the people of, or experienced by the people of Leningrad. And in this way, Symphony makes more comments on not only history, but also writing and literature, so that it makes clear that certain historical events demand equally specific modes of representation. So in the same interview, Anderson stated that during his research, he realized that the material was so strange, so bizarre, that if you turned it into fiction, no one would believe it. It retains its power, its strangeness more if it's nonfiction. And so he says in interviews that there was an ethical reason for him to write this as nonfiction, that he wanted his readers to be completely clear that this is not fantasy, this is not made up, this is history, and that if it bears so much of a resemblance to the dystopias they encounter in fiction, this is because this is part of the source of these nightmarish stories, and that they must take seriously this history, that has happened and it could happen again. And also because he writes this as nonfiction, he wants his readers to recognize that they cannot judge the characters, these historical personages, in the same way that they would as fictional characters. That, for example, one of the questions he anticipates his his young readers having is, well, why would Shostakovich sign up voluntarily to serve Stalin's regime? Why would so many Leningraders sign up if they hated their government so much? And he reminds them that this is not so easy, that the reasons for fighting for a regime might be for reasons other than the support of the actual government itself, that human psychology and human belief in a nation exceeds perhaps of specific ideologies or politics. He also cautions his readers against imagining themselves as historical characters. Following a very excruciatingly painful and violent summary of the torment that was suffered by people during the purges, he writes, when we read tales of atrocity, we all want to be the ones who stood firm, who would not bend, who shouted the truth in the face of the dictator. It's easy for us to imagine we were heroes when we were sitting in our kitchens dreaming of distant suffering. That as much as we would like to imagine ourselves as heroes, as much as we desire that wish fulfillment that we do when we're reading dystopian novels, the fact of the matter is that circumstances compelled people to act otherwise in ways that we can't imagine because we are not in their places. And so he asks for a humane return or a reconsideration of history. So this is a book that is intended for young adult or even new adult audiences. It's relatively sophisticated. So the question becomes, how do works of Bloodlands fiction, other works of Bloodlands fictions, address readers at different stages of literacy and psychological development? And how do they address the contemporary circumstances of their variously aged North American readers? So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking very briefly about picture books, middle grade books, and also YA novels, and how they're addressing Bloodlands themes and audiences of different ages. So the first book that I'd like to talk about is Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch's picture book Enough, that was illustrated by Michael Marchenko. You might recognize Michael Marchenko as the illustrator of Paperback Princess, which is that kind of iconic feminist picture book. Here, Enough is a story that is based on a conglomeration of Ukrainian fairy tales, and it's about the Ukrainian famine, or the Holodomor, that period in early 1930s Ukraine in which the Soviet government, first of all, expropriated grain from wealthier farmers who were very terribly wealthy, and then started taking grain from collective farmers, and then even took away the seed grain from most Ukrainian farmers throughout central and eastern Ukraine, to the point where they were left with nothing at all and began to starve in their own homes. There was a point where Ukrainian villages were sealed off so that people couldn't leave them and starved in their own villages. When they did leave, as you'll see in the picture on the photograph on the left, in the streets of Kharkiv, they were left to die. This has become a major trauma, especially in Ukraine. It has been recognized as a genocide against Ukrainians who were especially opposed to the Soviet regime. And first recognized as a genocide by Raphael Lemkin, who himself, as a Polish Jewish intellectual, coined the term genocide. And we've just celebrated in Ukraine and in diaspora the 80th anniversary of this genocide. And so this is the context in which this picture book takes place. And as you can imagine, it's a very difficult topic to address to young readers. So how does Skrypuch do this? Well, the story here, again, based on a fairy tale, Marusia is a little girl who lives with her father, her tato, in central Ukraine. And one day a soldier comes and demands their grain. They give him a little bit of grain and he comes back and he gets more and more until they have nothing left at all except for one seed. And they know that they're going to die soon. But overnight, the seed blooms into a giant stalk, and on the stalk is a stork. And the stork asks Marusia what she wants, and she says, I just need just enough grain to keep us alive. So the stork takes her on his back to a magical land of plenty, where people say, we hardly have enough ourselves, but we can spare you some grain. And they give her some grain, and she takes it back to Ukraine, and where they're able to plant it and hide it from the soldier. This is a fairy tale. Later on, because every fairy tale needs an enemy or some sort of someone opposed to the hero, the soldier himself discovers a stork, makes the stork fly him to the land of plenty, and takes more than he needs, and is so overwhelmed by his burden of bags that he tumbles into the ocean. So this initially seems to be a little more than a consoling morality tale. So with a nice moral, like it's better to share than to store one's riches, or the meek will inherit the world, etc. It also involves a fairy tale happy ending that involves a lot of wish fulfillment. And the fact of the matter is that most Ukrainian peasants starved to death during Holodomor. Nobody came to their aid. Of course, Skrypuch knows this. She's self-consciously chosen a fairy tale, and she realizes that this is a work of fiction. But it's the larger commentary here that is important, and I think it contains a lot of nuance. First of all, there's a wonderful passage in which the soldier tells Marusia and her tato that we have a dictator now, so your wheat and your farm now belong to the people. And Marusia responds, we are the people, capital P. Here, very subtly, Skrypuch makes it clear that Marusia is alluding to the fact that Ukrainian peasants, even though they were technically part of the Soviet Union, part of the people, capital P, were also excluded from the people. They were what Giorgio Agamben has called bare life, life that can be sacrificed, but not, or that can be killed but not sacrificed, that they were on the margins of society and therefore could be killed for the sake of the larger people. And so little moments like this make some commentary. Also, Marchenko's use of color is very important here. So as you'll notice, red is a predominant color, not just in these images, but throughout the book. And throughout the book, all of the peasants wear red, not only the peasants in Ukraine, but also the peasants in this magical land that she's visiting now. Red, of course, is the color of life, of blood. It's also the color of communism. And so there's a kind of a visual pun or a visual commentary here that the peasants were the true communists insofar as peasant villages shared what they had, whereas the communist government was actually extracting from them, from the people, capital P. There's also some clever visual nods here when the dictator shows up to survey the lands that he has conquered. And he has that handlebar mustache that immediately identifies him as Stalin. At the same time, he's not wearing that drab military uniform that Stalin does, but rather the uniform of a Tsar. And the uniform that, for example, Nicholas II would wear. And in this way, very subtly, the book nods to how the Soviet oppression of the Ukrainian peasantry was in effect a second serfdom, that the Ukrainian peasants weren't part of the people, but were just were occupied by the Soviet imperial forces. This also addresses a particular audience, obviously young people, but also their elders, their caregivers, parents, grandparents who are reading this. The book was published in Canada and was illustrated and authored by Canadian authors and illustrators. And it's very clear throughout the course of the book that the land of plenty that they visit is Canada itself, that Marusha, as she's on the stork's back, looks down and she sees an ocean go by, and then forests and lakes, and then an endless prairie with patches of dust and wheat. And she sees men and women dressed in the clothing of Ukraine. So we hear them now. They're wearing embroidered shirts, but they're also wearing jeans, that we see kind of this east and west. And she visits that area of Canada that was settled by Ukrainian immigrants and Ukrainian settlers. And this plays, first of all, to readers who are themselves members of the Ukrainian diaspora. There's a suggestion here that still the members of the diaspora should be responsible to their Ukrainian cousins in Ukraine itself. But also it appeals to Canadians more generally, to a sense of Canadian multiculturalism, the sense of the Canadian cultural mosaic, that Canada has prided itself on being a welcoming land of immigrants, a cultural mosaic, and that in recent years it's prided itself on taking in immigrants from Afghanistan, from Syria, from other troubled places in the world. And so even to contemporary readers, the moral of the story is to share what one has. So there's a larger kind of national moral here that plays to a larger audience. If we move from picture books to illustrated books for middle grade readers, one book that I would share would be Breaking Stalin's Nose by Eugene Yelchin, who was born in Russia, in the Soviet Union, as it were, and emigrated to the United States later on in his life, and wrote Breaking Stalin's Nose, published it in 2011, and this is loosely based in part on his father's own experiences and also his own experiences, but with kind of a twist. This is a book that Yelchin not only wrote, but also illustrated, because he was, first of all, a painter and an artist. The protagonist of this book is a young boy named Sasha Zajic, a little bunny, who is in awe of Stalin. He knows that his father has valiantly served Stalin, and he even, at the beginning of the novel, is writing Stalin a letter telling him that he will always be faithful to him. But, however, on the night before he is set to be inducted into the Young Pioneers, his father is arrested, and he doesn't understand why this is, because his father is the person who has taught him to be loyal to Stalin in the first place. So he thinks that this is a mistake. The second major thing that happens the next day, when he goes into school, convinced that his father is going to come back and say it's all been a mistake, is that when he's sent to fetch the flag that will be used during the Young Pioneer ceremony, he accidentally drops it, and he breaks a ceramic bust of Stalin and breaks the nose off of this bust. And this becomes discovered, and his teacher holds a veritable show trial in the classroom, in which she gets different members of the class to, innocent people, to confess that they were the ones who broke Stalin's nose. Sasha himself runs away in fear, and as he runs away, he goes into a biology or chemistry classroom where the fumes are very heavy, and he sees this vision of Stalin's nose, talking to him. And this is kind of a break from the otherwise realistic narrative of the story, where Stalin's nose comes alive and starts berating Sasha and telling him that he is guilty, that his father is guilty, and reminding him that what hasn't really been explicitly told thus far, that his mother did not die in hospital out of some sort of disease, but she herself had been arrested and killed, and that his father is the next to be a victim of the purges, and he himself may be as well. The nose moment is, of course, a reference or an allusion to Gogol's The Nose, first written in 1835, and also Shostakovich's own opera based on the nose. In this short story, we have this element of absurdity where the nose comes off of the civil servant's face and not only returns as his doppelganger, but actually outperforms him and causes the civil servant great amount of anxiety. It's a work of absurdism in a way that in some ways its illusion underscores the absurdity of tyranny, the absurdity of totalitarianism, where people say one thing but believe another thing. Also, this moment with a nose becomes this moment of magical realism that breaks the realism of the narrative and causes the reader to question the narrative pacing and time, to question what is real, what is not, just as Sasha himself is questioning everything that he has further up to this point believed is real and starts doubting what he has been taught in the past. So this narrative departure from realism is very important to the narrative. There's also many departures from chronological time here, and a slowing down and a speeding up of time. So throughout the narrative, there are images of time moving very quickly, and trams quickly moving, dashing down, shuttling down steep hills in a way that remind us of Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin and that famous baby carriage scene of history unbridled and moving very quickly. At the same time, within the narrative, there are moments of not only time slowing down, but moving backward, especially in this last illustration in which Sasha is waiting to hear news of his father and is waiting in this line that is so long that it even trails backwards, as though everything that has been accomplished in these earlier utopian movements have just been warped, just as the memory itself becomes warped. And so even though this is a relatively straightforward story that can be read by middle grade readers, there's so much historical complexity and commentary on Soviet time, on the question of history and what is real and what is truth. Finally, the last example that I'd like to give is Ruta Zapetis's Between Shades of Gray, which is published in 2011. It had the misfortune of being published around the time of 50 Shades of Gray, even though the story is very, very different. So this is the story of Lina, who is based on Zapetis's own conglomeration of her own family members from Lithuania. Zapetis herself is Lithuanian American. This is her first novel. And she writes the story of Lina, who lives in a relatively well-to-do middle-class home in Lithuania. And one day, seemingly out of nowhere, there's a knock on her door, and she and her mother and her siblings are told that they need to pack their bags because they are under arrest. They don't understand why they're under arrest or what they've done, but they're under arrest and they are deported to Siberia. And so the story tells basically about her experiences of hunger, her experiences of sexual threat, her experiences of the bitter cold and having to build her own house and a community from nothing in the bitter Arctic Circle, and the survival. And of course, because this is a YA novel, a children's novel, there is a happy ending. She does return. There is a minor love plot. And yet there are basic tropes of the deportation novel at work here. What is very interesting here, as Marek Oziewicz has argued, is that The tropes that we see in Between Shades of Grey are also very visible in other narratives for both children and adults of both Nazi and Soviet forced deportation. So these stories include such elements as they open with a period of living under occupation when the family property is confiscated and the community is becoming aware of even worse forms of terror. They depict the dehumanization of people under the totalitarian system, whether it's Nazism or Stalinism, and in each case foregrounded in the experience of deportation and camp life. They feature scenes of humiliation and or the threat of sexual violence. This is especially so in narratives of Soviet oppression. And he says, perhaps the most ubiquitous detail of camp life, however, is hunger, this persistent hunger. And one thing that readers of these narratives might recognize is how they too are affected by the sense of hunger just by reading it. And they also involve characters' resistance to degradation. And this is key for YA and children's narratives and is different from perhaps narratives that are written for adults, that there usually is a return home and a return home not only of the main character, but at least one loved one with which the character is associated, even though the character might lose others. And there's a sense of resistance because there's a sense of hope for the young generation to which this is written. I might add one more thing to Marek's list, and that is the trope of the mirror that I've noticed in both narratives of Nazi and Stalinist deportation narratives, where a character has been in camp life for so long that they haven't seen their reflection. And the first time they see their reflection, let's say in a hospital ward, they don't recognize the person in the mirror, that there's a doubleness of their identity. There's a doubleness between the person that they once were and the person that they are now that they barely recognize. So we see these shared tropes, and I think this is very important. On the one hand, we have to recognize that it's crucial that we make a distinction between the Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes, that they were distinct. They deployed different forms of discourses, different forms of torture, different forms of torment and execution. At the same time, it's also significant to recognize the way that they mutually informed one another. In some ways, this brings us back to Anderson's quote about communism and fascism clutching each other's fists behind the back, that so much of what informed or inspired Hitler was enacted by Stalin and vice versa. So if we see these coincidences or these parallels, they're not mere coincidences, that there are certain kinds of structures in place by these totalitarian systems. And certainly this is something that Hannah Arendt brings to our attention in Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she traces the historical structures that were in place in order for these totalitarian regimes to take life. Anti-Semitism, colonialism, also mob rule, and a breakdown of rationality. At the same time, a fervent belief in rationalism in a way that became in some ways irrational. Also, many of these narratives of Soviet deportation and Nazi deportation are written by second-generation members of families. So like Sepethus, who were inspired by stories that were told to them by their elders and memories that they received. And these memories, because they took place at roughly the same time, also draw on certain kinds of parallels that we see. And it's important to recognize this because in the past, there has been what Michael Rothberg, a Holocaust scholar, has called competitive memory, where, for example, in the historians' debate of the 1980s, there was a sense that the Nazi genocide or the Soviet genocide had to be recognized in tension with one another, or that one had to be seen as unique and another as derivative. And instead, Rothberg has argued that we think about memory as multi-directional, as mutually informing, that memory isn't a a zero-sum game over scarce resources, but rather he suggests that we consider memory as multi-directional, as subject to ongoing cross-referencing and borrowing, as productive and not private. The way that narratives mutually inform each other so that when we see them and we compare them and recognize them as distinct, we also see the larger structures that they depict and the way that they speak to one another. So finally, in conclusion, I know that I'm nearing my end here. The question becomes, why does Bloodlands literature matter? And I would argue first and foremost, it matters because so many of these stories haven't been told. It's only been very, very recently, for example, that the story of the Holodomor has been told both by historians and also by authors. And these stories have been silenced. They have been deemed not appropriate to tell to children, even though other stories of historical atrocity long have been told to children. And so this is the moment of recovering them and also placing them into relation with other narratives of historical trauma, not just the Holocaust, but for example, of enslavement, of different structures of racism, of imperialism, of colonialism. I would also argue that the European bloodlands become very important for us to recognize because they marked a culturally, ethnically, linguistically, religiously diverse region of shifting borders, ideological sympathies, and simmering regional resentments that prefigure a later era of globalization where borders are shifting again, where religious differences and cultural and ethnic differences again have been heightened, where internecine warfare again is simmering and is blooming. And in this moment when late global capitalism increasingly tips toward a major global climate crisis, we see that it's important to re-examine past crises. Of course, it's important to recognize the past not as determined, that these cultural traumas aren't going to occur again in exactly the same way they did in the early 20th century, that they're contingent, and yet that we can see how certain discourses, how certain conflicts might play out, and see certain kind of warnings or, as it were, red flags within the present. An additional argument is that North Americans have not eluded tyranny, certainly not at this moment, and in fact, Europeans have never quite escaped it. And here I reference Timothy Snyder's other book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, that was published in 2017, a year after the American elections in 2016, in which Snyder warns his readers of how the events of the past that Eastern Europeans know so well from their experience of both Nazism and Stalinism might serve as warning for the present, for North Americans and Europeans today, if not for the larger global community. So, for example, he speaks of the politics of eternity, this discourse that it's always been this way and will always be this way, this belief in larger kind of historical myths of a great past that can be resurrected, a past that never really existed in the first place. He also speaks of the politics of inevitability, that there are certain kinds of laws of history that are in fact determined and will take place. And he cautions readers that these politics that represent the discourses of Nazism and Stalinism respectively are returning in the discourses of the present. And he calls his readers to be aware of them. And he gives his readers 20 lessons from the early 20th century from these moments of these twin totalitarian regimes. So he cautions his readers not to obey in advance, to be wary of paramilitaries, to be kind to language and be careful about how language is used, especially when it pertains to questions of class or race or ethnicity. To at once practice corporeal politics, to be present and aware, bodily involved in politics, but also to establish a private life and to treasure a sense of privacy even as one acts within the public. And then also to be calm when the unthinkable happens, because he warns, just as the unthinkable, for example, the Reichstag happened before, it can happen again at a little warning. And, you know, in some ways we see see a prelude to this from January 6th in the United States. But most significantly, Snyder identifies today's young people as the historical generation, whose studied acquaintance with a contingent and unromantic past might allow them to make informed and critical decisions about their present and future. And he says that members of such a historical generation have to possess the potential to think beyond the deterministic notions of history espoused by communism or the nostalgic or otherwise mythical visions of the past celebrated by fascism, that they need to learn critically, to think critically, to question the myths of the past, to question conventional wisdom, to question even what they are given in their own history classes, to ask good questions, to read carefully. And he says that one thing is certain, even if these other myths are not certain. If young people do not begin to make history, politicians of eternity and inevitability will destroy it. And to make history, young Americans will have to know some. It's my argument that Bloodlands literature is one step in allowing young Americans not only to know some history, but to think critically about history. So thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Anya, for this amazing lecture. Very thought-provoking and so rich, really beautifully researched. Thank you. I think that now it's time for our audience to ask some questions, and I'm sure that there will be many questions. So remember that you can pose your questions in the meeting chat, or you can just raise your hand and just go ahead. Oh, yes, the first question. Okay, Justyna Mentrak, who is our graduate student, has a question. Thank you for this fascinating lecture, Professor Ulanowicz. It is an honor to have you here in Wrocław. I have noticed that in most Canadian books discussed in Dr. Świetlicki's classes, the Ukrainian and Polish protagonists are young women attempting to keep the traumatic memories of the Holodomor, the Holocaust immigration alive by sharing them with their granddaughters. What is the role of motherhood and femininity in the transfer of memory in the books you have mentioned during today's presentation? A very good question, Justyna. A very good question. A very good one. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think probably my initial response is that that memory has often been thought of in maternal terms as sustaining a community, nurturing a community, that often diasporic communities think of themselves as organic in ways that sort of privilege those kinds of maternal metaphors. And yes, as you point out, often it is the women who are the memory keepers. I think partly because of those more perhaps traditional roles of the mother as the storyteller, the mother who tells the stories to the children, but also the mother and also the teacher who brings children together and cares for them and nurtures them. And now that I think about it, I'd like to think further about when those tropes are perhaps broken or challenged, when it is the boy instead who becomes the caregiver. But usually, for example, in Enough, it is the girl child or the woman. Thank you.
Yeah, when it comes to breaking this trope, I think that the only real example I can think of is Larry Warwick's Andre and the Snowwalker. I think that's the only example I can think of. Yeah. There's another question. Yeah. There's another question, Karolina Szymborska. Your hand is raised, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. Thank you very much for a very riveting presentation. It's really thought-provoking. I have a question. Do you see this new literature, this borderline literature, as a process of transforming communicative memory in terms of Astrid Erl into more cultural memory? Is this the broader process, as you can notice? In distinguishes this and the second question is about distinguishing children's history from the adult history. Can you see the differences, because you mentioned Anne Frank diary. Is it a difference? Is it only the perspective of the adults mentioned in those texts, or the children appear and their understanding on history they appear in those books, or are there just involuntary passive participants of the bloodline literature? Are there protagonists? How these children protagonists are focalized in this literature?
Mm-hmm. Oh, those are lovely questions. I would start maybe with the second one that you asked. I think often they begin as perhaps more passive agents in which, history is acting upon them, but usually over the course of the narrative, over the arc of the narrative, they claim some sort of agency that I think is very crucial to perhaps not necessarily the formula, but the conventions of young adult or children's literature, which privileges the child's agency, the child's resistance, and that also allows for some semblance of a happy ending that is guaranteed, that is not necessarily at work in novels that are written for adults. I think perhaps Anderson's book comes closest to challenging that, but of course Anderson's book is more for young adult readers, or even, for example, new adult readers. May I ask if you could repeat your first question, because I remember it was very good. But
yes, I was asking about do you see this new literature as a process from this changing in literature, this passive that you mentioned, that firstly it was about not about this eastern, not western, not eastern form, and that there this growth of literature. Do you see in this process of transforming this literature into this proper genius loci of non-memory literature of pure Nora? Place and literature and bloodline as a transforming communicative memory into cultural memory. This is a kind of process of transforming the memory and how it's distributed and into the literature, into the didactics, and in general in picture books for children.
Yes, I think I could speak to this first of all by speaking about Enough, which is a book that I've written about for a long time, and I've actually spoken on many occasions with the author herself. And I know that her intention initially was just to bring the Holodomor into larger public knowledge, because it's so well known within Ukrainian diaspora, but so little known within a larger North American culture. And so her first intention was to transmit that memory to a larger culture, to non-Ukrainians as well as Ukrainians. At the same time, she encountered a lot of resistance to this, especially in the early 2000s. There are readers who thought that by writing about Holodomor, she was somehow denying the Holocaust. Here we have the entrance of competitive memory, and she really struggled to find a publisher for this. I think that things are changing, where the Holodomor has become much more recognized in Canada, in the mainstream, and the US, and has been written about much more in children's literature and adult literature. It still hasn't necessarily seeped into a larger cultural memory in the way I think that, for example, the Holocaust has. I think also, though, that there's always a difficulty or a danger that's involved when an historical event, especially a traumatic historical event, becomes so steeped in cultural memory. I had this experience when I was flying to Poland, actually, and I was in the Atlanta airport, and I was looking for something to read, and I was looking at the bookshelves, and there were about 7 or 8 books that were about the something or other of Auschwitz, or the seamstress of Auschwitz, or the janitor of Auschwitz. All of these stories, these Holocaust-themed stories, and I concern that this has transformed Holocaust memory into what has been called the Holocaust industry, where it becomes a source of maybe melancholy, or at worst entertainment. And I think that this happens when an event tips into cultural memory, that I think people who are close to it are careful to avoid. I'm not quite sure how much this answers your question, but I think that for the most part, and we've talked about this with Mateusz, that many of these Bloodlands books are still considered perhaps ethnic fiction rather than mainstream fiction. I think M.T. Anderson's book might be an exception only because he's such a well-known author to begin with.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And there is another question by Marek Oziewicz.
Oh, Marek.
Yes,
hi,
our
Anya.
very special guest.
See you. How are you?
Spot now.
I love this presentation. Thank you so much. I particularly liked the way you wrapped it up with references to Applebaum, to 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, because, and this is a question that I'm struggling with now, how do we make this literature more relevant to our concerns in our reality as we see this consolidation of autocratic regimes from China, Russia, Belarus, now the threat to Ukraine, so it seems in a very weird way like history is repeating itself, that there is a momentum of autocracy building up, so this is like a political concern in itself. But then my thinking is, okay, how do we tell these stories of events that happened 60, 80 years ago without allowing them to merely fade into history, because current events that are similar in some ways takes the center stage? So how do we create this dialogue between this literature and sort of current concerns? So I guess that's it's a big issue. It's not a single question, it's a cluster of questions, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
Oh, that's a huge question, and it's one that I really struggle with, and and I've been struggling with, as we formulate this project. What immediately comes to mind is a book that you recommended to me, which is Siberia, which is set in Siberia, and is at the beginning of the book, I was kind of reading it cold. I had no idea what this book was about. And it seemed to me as though this was telling the story of deportations to Siberia and of a young person who is a prisoner, kind of in sort of an open air gulag. And as the novel continues on, we realize that it's rather set in the future in this climate dystopia, and it really is about a future in which species extinction has happened, and there's a clear demarcation between a very privileged minority and people who have been disinvested. And so it brings together that received memory of a totalitarian regime and a future that is becoming increasingly present, in a way that perhaps allows us to think about that marriage between the present and the past and the future. So I would begin with that book, but I'm not quite sure where to take that, because that question is so huge. And it's so important, so important.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, it's like thinking through these issues, making connections to have this body of works which are only recently, they're sort of exploding, to make them relevant to present concerns, the way that, for example, we have discussions around racial issues and exploitation, that the way that we have discussions around multiculturalism, so and this concern that you expressed also, that even today most of this literature is sort of pushed to the margins as ethnic literature, that it's not mainstream. And it's a similar kind of problem that we have with multicultural literature, that there is still this thinking in terms of, oh, mainstream literature is this sort of mainstream thing, and then on the side you have multicultural literature for some people who are interested, which is, we don't want to have that kind of map. Yeah, so and it brings so many other questions, like, should Germans, for example, as victims of the Soviet regime, be considered victims proper, or are they like victims on the same level as Ukrainians or Poles? And there's this book that just came out, Greta. It's by Katerina Janečková. It's about the expulsion of Czech Germans. And there was a march of death where thousands froze to death. They were expelled from they walked towards, I don't know, Austria or Germany. Anyway, so it really, it's a super complicated story that we are telling these stories too late. They should have been told 20, 30 years ago. So I don't know. But yeah, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful talk.
Well, thank you so much for your questions and your remarks. And I think that, as far as the question about Germans is concerned, my immediate response would be to say yes, because the question of the Bloodlands itself, as Snyder makes clear, is that these boundaries were so blurred, and that the borders themselves, literal borders, but then borders between victims and oppressors, or good and evil, were so blurred and grayed that who is a victim and who is an oppressor becomes less at the forefront than how was totalitarianism, how were injustices perpetrated in the first place. I would say, however, maybe going back to your initial questions and observations about relevance and how to make these books relevant, I think in some ways, even though this is too late, as you say, and it is too late, at least North Americans are paying more attention to Eastern Europe than they were 4 years ago. And it's unfortunate. I think that suddenly Ukraine was on the map in ways that it hadn't been before, because the first impeachment, and Ukraine and Poland, now Belarus, continue to be on the map, or at least in their consciousness, even though that's questionable. I just read this is a digression, but I just read an article that Fox News is defending Russia as far as their actions in Ukraine and Belarus are concerned. But anyway, at least people recognize where these places are, and that there was a history of them, for better or worse.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this great question, and Anya, thank you for your answers. Yes, there's another question. So Joe, please go ahead.
Hi there, Anya.
Hello.
Hey, it's so good to see you. I'm such a fan of your work, and I really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much for this. So I wanted to ask about a comment that you made at the end. With the whole thing was so interesting, but I was interested in this comment at the end. Snyder identifies today's young people as the historical generation who studied acquaintance with a contingent and unromantic past might allow them to make informed and critical decisions about their present and future. And I do love this idea that there is something unique about the younger generation that might actually position them better to be able to deal with this knowledge and with the recurrence of history. I wanted to ask about two other qualities of today's youth, if you'll forgive the expression, that I think might also position them well. One is, as I talk with my colleagues in multiple countries, there's a real sense that young people, and here I mean 25 years old and younger, have a level of empathy that I don't think we had when we were their age, and also that there's not just a comfort with, not just a tolerance of, but a sort of bone deep recognition of gender fluidity. It seems to me that young people today have these things much better than we did when we were their age. And I wonder if you feel like these things might also play into their ability to rise to the challenge of these issues.
I think that they do. I think that, maybe this is a cliche, but social media is a blessing and a curse. And so it brings together people from all over the world and allows people to see from other perspectives and to engage with different voices. At the same time, it also depends on algorithms that create dangerous repetitions. But I think that if I'm being optimistic, it does allow for experience of empathy, of a way of thinking outside of how one has initially been taught, for example, about gender, about even questions of race or ethnicity or religion. My sense, however, is that Snyder wants to end on some sort of hopeful note, and the go-to kind of recipient of this hope tends to be the younger generation, partly because we, the older generation, don't know what else to do, and we look to younger people, and I'm really in awe of young people, of my students, and how much more expansively they think about the world than I do. I think about activists, both the well-known ones, Greta Thunberg or Malala, but also just the young people in my own city, in my own community, who will walk out of school for climate justice or for racial justice. And we want to kind of bank on that. At the same time, I wonder how much in the minority they are. Whether they're the only hope, I don't know. But I do think that there is a potential for them to know about history, to be a historical generation, perhaps better than my generation or our generation was, just because they have more access. But just because one has more access to information doesn't mean that they always have access to useful information, or trustworthy or productive knowledge. It's a lot. It's something I really struggle with.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we have another question by Emily, who's our guest. Emily, go ahead.
Oh my goodness, Emily.
Emily, you're muted. We cannot hear you.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Yes, we can hear you now. Wonderful.
So I haven't fully thought this out, but I was just thinking about some of the comments and what you were saying in response to Joe. And I guess one of the things that it makes me think about is the risk of putting too much emphasis on the younger generation, and thinking about keeping that intergenerational aspect. So thinking about some of your earlier work on second generation memory, and to what extent, does that remain important as an aspect of remembering these events that for so long weren't passed on for various reasons, right? And not only as a kind of, as someone earlier said, a kind of matrilineal passing on from mother to daughter, for instance. But yeah, just a kind of rethinking of how we, rather than just saying, okay, the older generation, we didn't have enough empathy, or we didn't have this. And I'm not saying that that's what Joe was saying. Kind of shifting the way that we think about attending to some of the issues that you've raised here.
I think this is a wonderful question, and I think that it really is the second generation that becomes the first kind of keepers of these memories. Often the older generation that actually experienced these events were so traumatized that it was difficult for them even to talk about them. Often their children and grandchildren found out about their experiences sideways, as it were, so that not necessarily from immediate direct testimony, but by realizing that our family is different from our other families, our grandparents or parents act differently. We know that they were alive during this time, and so they start piecing together clues about their past in which they are able to kind of cobble together some sort of narrative of what happened. And they become the ones who really consolidate these memories and keep them, and sometimes in very gendered ways, as you noted and as someone else earlier noted. And that these stories that are being passed then to the historical generation really were safeguarded by the second one, and who recognized the vulnerability of them, the precarity of them, and really honored their parents' own memories. And so that generation really needs to be admitted. And I liked what you said. I think that in some ways this goes to Justina's own research on intergenerational solidarity and the way that these narratives are co-creative and memory is co-created between generations. First between the generation that directly experienced the events and the ones who consolidated them, but then also the producers, the second generation, who publish these narratives and, like Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch, present them to schools and engage in conversation and dialogue with young people, so that there's the memory becomes organic and shared and cooperatively or collaboratively produced, because memory is always organic, it's always living, it's never a static thing, it's never the event itself, it's always shifting and changing, and that occurs between generations. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for one more question. So if you have a question, please go ahead. Let me check the meeting chat.
If there's no other questions, I did have a quick comment in response to what Marek was saying, actually, and it just made me think of some of the work that I'd recently been doing as part of a grantscape where we're meant to work with policymakers and practitioners. And it was interesting because he had been talking about history and a kind of emphasis on presentness, right? And how do you make these stories seem relevant, right? And that was the same thing that I kind of felt like you would have to make more of a case for history, that when you're working, say, with policymakers, they don't see the relevance. And actually, interestingly, they did. They found that they found it really useful for talking about histories of migration, for instance, in communities where not just those who had recently come to, say, that city or town or to the country even more widely, but who had come in previous generations. And so maybe there is more thinking around to do with the way we can connect up these academic conversations to work that's happening in policy, and that there actually is more of an interest than we might think in these stories.
Oh, that's good to know. That's very helpful. I'd also be curious to hear more about how that process occurs and how what conversations or what dialogue occurs in that process.
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to share.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily, for your comment. And I think that it's already 7:30, meaning that our time is up. Anya, thank you for this amazing lecture. Thank you a lot, and I would like to thank all of the attendees, and also the Fulbright Commission and the Institute of English Studies, which made your visit possible. So we really appreciate it.
Yes. Well,
thank you.
I thank you, Mateusz and Justyna and the Institute, Fulbright Commission, and everyone here. I so enjoyed speaking with you and answering questions and responding to your wonderful questions. It's really been a pleasure. So thank you.